The Earth is flat. To some of you, this may be an outrageous claim, but there's more evidence for it than you may think. This argument rests on three pillars. One, that our modern conception of gravity is wrong. Two, that the Earth's surface is not actually curved. And that three, the Earth does not revolve around the sun. And I'll show you that the true shape of the Earth is a flat disk centered around the North Pole. So, Eric Verlinde, the professor of theoretical physics at the University of Amsterdam, published in 2010 the book On the Origin of Gravity and the Laws of Newton, where he wrote about how gravity is considerably harder to combine with quantum mechanics than all the other forces. And the quest of unification of gravity leads to many problems, paradoxes, and puzzles, and there's no clear explanation for where gravity comes from. Because it cannot be tied to quantum mechanics, and because it does not explain how particles interact at small scales, gravity acts more like a temperature where it's its ability of a thing rather than a fundamental force itself. And without being a fundamental force, it doesn't seem to have as much impact on larger bodies as it may suggest. The other reason why gravity may be entirely wrong is that it requires two unobservable, unquantifiable materials called dark matter and dark energy. The National Geographic lists that dark matter must contain 25% of the universe and dark energy contains 70% for our known observations to match what we think about the equations of gravity. But requiring 95% of the universe to be something that doesn't interact with matter or radiation that we can never actually observe is laughable, and we can Occam's razor it away. The surface of the Earth being curved is hard to prove, mostly because on land the Earth can be artificially flattened, so it's not useful. But water should conform to the convexity of the Earth if the Earth is indeed a sphere. The Bedford Level experiment, which was conducted in England in 1882 and then again in 1885 by the zetetic philosophers Samuel Ropertham and Elizabeth Blunt. Zetetic philosophy is proof by inquiry, where everything is proved by experimentation first. It's a part of the Socratic method developed by Socrates. In this experiment, the sign hung from a bridge arch, and they drove a boat 6 miles away and then viewed it through a telescope 8 inches above the water. If the Earth was indeed curved, then there would be a hill of water 10 feet high, but with the sign hanging 6 feet low and the telescope was 8 inches above the water, they were still able to see the bottom of the sign, meaning that there was not a hill of water high enough to conclude the convexity of the Earth. This is also demonstrated by William Carpenter in his book 100 Proofs There Is Not a Globe in 1885, where he showed that if you watch a boat sail off to sea, the hull will disappear first, but if you look at it again through a telescope, the boat will reappear, sail to hull, and you can watch the hull disappear again, meaning the boat did not disappear over a hill of water, it is just farther away. Another evidence for the Earth not being curved is the fact that both the Baltic and North Sea Canal, along with the Suez Canal, are both 161 miles long respectively, but none of them have locks to raise or lower the boats, meaning that the seas must be the same height. And the seas cannot be the same height hundreds of miles apart unless the Earth was indeed flat. The final piece of evidence for the Earth not being curved was in 2014. We experienced what's called a selenelion, which is when there is a total lunar eclipse, but the sun is still visible in the sky, which would not be possible as a total lunar eclipse requires them to be 180 degrees apart. And Joe Rao on the website sciencespace.com writes that selenelion is a phenomenon that celestial geometry says is impossible. And finally, the Earth does not revolve around the sun. So the stars in the sky vary too minutely from day to day for the Earth to be traveling the 584 million miles around the sun that would be required if we were indeed revolving around it. Tycho Brahe mentioned this in his works, and it's recorded here in the Terra Firma by D. Scott, a zetetic astronomer, that Tycho Brahe's chief objections against the theory of revolving Earth revolved around these stars. Experiments were tried in his day at intervals of 6 months to test if there was any difference, but none was found. Because the stars vary too few, the Earth cannot be actually revolving. The final piece of evidence for why the Earth does not revolve around the sun is that the sun appears to lag as it gets closer to the pole star and appears to stretch as it gets farther away from the pole star. This apparent independent motion of the sun was recorded by Richard Russell in 1892 in his book Wonders of the Sun, Moon, and Stars, Elementary Astronomy. And this apparent independent movement seems to account for longer and shorter days and the whole phenomenon of seasons, but why the sun lags as described and why it moves in such a way, there's no apparent evidence for. If the Earth is not flat and gravity does not work the way we say it does, and the Earth does not revolve around the sun, how should it be considered to be round?
Okay, well, the proposition's identified, and you've got a preview of what the supporting structure is going to be. I think the controversy on this is relatively apparent, but I'm not exactly sure why we're having this discussion. So I think it's one of those things that you need to kind of give a little bit more explanation of and why it is it matters in the long run. There is a layout of what the supporting structure is going to be, but some of those points that you present, I don't know that they are clearly understandable. One of the things that's consistent is that you set up an assumption that has to be true without the audience necessarily understanding the nature of that assumption and why it has to be true, and then you try and demonstrate that that assumption can't possibly be true using a method that the audience, again, is going to have difficulty assessing in the amount of time that we have to do this. That, I think, is problematic. Second thing that's, I think, pretty problematic is the fact that 90% of the information that you're using is based on data that's more than 100 years old, and that kind of undermines some of your argument. You know, we've got... I heard one source citation from 2010 and one from 2014 talking about a particular event, but the rest of it is, 1892, 1895, and, Tycho Brahe is like in the 1400s, and there was another study that you made a reference to that also seemed kind of ancient in that particular context. So that there are original reasons why people might have thought that the Earth was flat, and there were scientific basis for thinking that, I think, are pretty good. I do think that the attempt to demonstrate this through physics without necessarily knowing that your audience is going to appreciate and understand all the physics involved in this is problematic. But I think that the response speaker is going to have other means by which they might demonstrate the opposite conclusion that have nothing to do with physics that everybody will be able to understand, which makes your argument feel a little bit less relevant and important than it should be.